Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Politics in the Pulpit, a lectionary-based preaching resource designed to ask those provocative questions of whether and how politics should appear in our preaching this week. My name is Beth Allison-Glenny, and I'm a Baptist minister, and I'm working as the Baptist Union's Public Issues Enabler. Each week, I'm joined by a guest from a different place or space on the political and pulpit spectrum. Today, I'm very pleased to introduce the Revd Dr Dan Pratt, who's the founder of the Together Free work. Hopefully he's going to appear on screen. Hi, Dan.
Hey, Beth, good to be with you.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Politics in the pulpit. I wonder what that means for you. Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself and whether or not you see yourself as kind of a pulpit politician?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, so politics is absolutely central to the work that I'm engaged with the Together Free Foundation. We're a charity that was established to help churches and communities respond to local forms of modern slavery and exploitation. So whether that is labour exploitation in maybe car washes or nail bars or agricultural sector, or it could be sexual exploitation or even domestic servitude or forced criminality. So what we're trying to do is promote slavery-free communities. And so we're helping resource churches and communities into doing that. So politics is very much at the centre of what I'm engaged with. We work with a huge amount of partners and do a lot of work with local councils, as well as law enforcement, and also third sector charitable organisations, and also faith groups. So yes, it's central to what we are, and also the ministry that I'm engaged with as an anti-slavery co-ordinator.
Now, Dan, this is probably the point we should admit that we know each other because we were at college together. We were. Bit of a shout out for Regent's Park there. So I know that you came into this work because of your work locally in church planting. And do you want to tell us, I don't know how much you're free to tell us about, a bit about how you got kind of more political, more focused in the work that you were doing from your work doing local church ministry?
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, while we were both at Regent's Park College, I was also engaged in pioneering a new church, which became known as 57 West. It was a church that was rooted among the rough sleeping and homeless community of Southend here in Essex. And it was really through encountering people who had no homes, no employment opportunities, and often no support networks, that we heard stories of exploitation. And so sometimes people would come to places where these vulnerable people would congregate, such as soup kitchens or churches, and try and recruit them, often for labour. So they'd be offered work and accommodation and wages. And so, of course, it's an appealing, attractive option, you know, if you've got nothing and then someone offers you all these things. But then often these offers were accepted, and they would go and work for very long hours, maybe doing paving people's driveways, tarmacking, working within fields or agriculture. But then they received very little pay or no pay at all. And when they tried to leave that situation, they ended up being threatened or coerced or controlled. And the worst case that I came across was an individual he'd escaped from his exploiters, but he had worked for them for 20 years. Wow. Doing labour just for hours and hours a day, being mistreated and treated horrendously. And so as a church community, we began to think, well, how do we respond to this? And we realised it wasn't just one or two individuals. Actually, this was happening quite frequently. And so we set up a localised anti-slavery partnership called the Southend Against Modern Slavery Partnership. And so my role now is to coordinate that and to try and escalate community responses to protect the most vulnerable, and to really think about safeguarding and how we identify potential victims of slavery.
Thank you. I think a lot of us who end up in roles that are about kind of the politics side of faith usually come with those pastoral stories at the heart of us, don't we? And I think one of the things I'm really hoping that it brings out over the next few weeks of these Politics in the Pulpit Politics in the Pulpit podcast. That is a tongue twister, isn't there? There's not one to say in the pulpit. Is it really trying to address this idea that the human stories that drive us to thinking we actually need to think about these things on kind of bigger scales than perhaps just doing kind of one-on-one work as well, that we want to change the world so more people don't get hurt and more people are kept safe.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if there's anything else. I'm thinking about kind of preaching this week and kind of sort of moving into kind of thinking about what kind of political questions or kind of justice issues might be in people's heads as they begin to prepare this week. Is there anything from kind of the work that you do that's on your radar that you kind of would highlight, or any resources you'd want to point people to?
Yeah, so I think with the work that I'm engaged with, it's very much trying to engage with political affairs relating to issues of injustice. So of course, relating to modern slavery and human trafficking. What's remarkable is there's some really good organisations out there who are engaged in either resourcing groups or churches to engage with the issue. Or even doing frontline work as well. So a few recommendations of resources relating to those would be organisations like Stop the Traffic. You've also got Hope for Justice. You've got International Justice Mission, the Kluwer Initiative, the Together Free Foundation. And interestingly, all these organisations are from Christian faith backgrounds. Mm-hmm. And so you've got a huge resource there in terms of Christians getting involved in the political sphere. And one thing I was thinking about, with politics in the pulpit, actually, like politics, it's about the affairs of the city. It's politica, the Greek, affairs of the city. So actually, how do we engage as Christians within the affairs of our cities? How do we work towards justice and God's reign and God's kingdom within our own context? And surely we should all be engaged in politics. Pulpit politics.
Preach it.
No, don't get us started. This is reminding me of the evenings that we had at the Lamb and the Flag in Oxford. Beth. Honestly, we start preaching to one another. I can see this going on.
I could ruin my career overnight. Lamb and the Flag, I don't know. But obviously drinking something that was definitely not alcoholic. So any Methodists listening in, definitely not alcoholic. Each week I ask my JPIT colleagues just a little bit of a roundup of kind of what we should hold in our minds as we come into the pulpit as kind of political events going on and justice issues that we might want to be alert to as we prepare. And so they say, as we're keeping an eye on the world this week, just to be aware, there are lots of conversations going on about vaccine rollout and how that can be done justly, both on a global scale, but also what the appropriate responses are going to be in a world where we will increasingly see most people having a vaccine and some not, and that kind of not all vaccine hesitancy is created equal, and also there being people who will slip through the net, perhaps in fact people in the sort of situations that you work with, Dan, who will slip through the net because they're not registered with GPs and won't be able to get vaccinations, and then not having any form of vaccine passport, whatever that might look like. That could lead into some complicated questions. But how do we do just life with people who feel unable for any reason to not have a vaccine? So there's that question going on, and it's beginning to really kind of come out in kind of opinion columns, just to be aware that's there. We might want to be thinking about that as Christians. Still Fair Trade Fortnight. And appropriately, the budget is also due this Wednesday. So we're recording this on a Monday, and by Sunday, the new budget will be out. And there will be commentary about that on the JPIT blog, I believe. And also, just be aware that will be setting the next economic scene as well. And as part of that, our 4 churches working together, our 4 denominations working together, we've submitted a short response to the government's consultation on debt relief orders alongside Christians Against Poverty. And so we've been working at kind of policy level because we care about those city issues. They might sound like Westminster to those of us who don't live in London, but actually these are people's lives, and we've been part of that, listening and working alongside Christians Against Poverty, and really highlight, if anybody needs resources around debt or anything, to look at the work of the Reset the Debt campaign that JPIT are part of running. And just flag that to anybody who's looking at some of these issues and thinking that this is a week to preach on economic justice for any reason. So I think we'll start to see in the text. So, and then of course it's still lockdown, it's still COVID, and many churches are choosing not to meet in the middle of this pandemic, despite having the freedom to do so, and are probably just starting to have that conversation. We're aware many pastors are having those conversations about kind of how and when do we open up safely and wisely for everyone. And so our prayers go with you, and please just keep checking your denominational websites for all that advice. And good people are doing lots of good work to help smooth the way. So we've had our metaphorical newspapers open in the one hand. So with our Bible then in the other, as we begin to prepare our sermons this week, we've got three passages. We've got one from Exodus, which is the 10 Commandments. So one we might be fairly familiar with, at least on a surface level. And then we've got one from, we've jumped to the Gospel of John from in the lectionary this week, which Jesus turning the money, cleansing the temple is the line that's used, which I think is an interesting phrase. But turning the money, the tables over in the temple. I've got some words in there somewhere. And then the last one is also we've got Corinthians, Christ, the power and the wisdom of God, just lurking there as our second reading. Alongside the gospel reading, the first reading. So these are our readings this week, Dan. I know you've had a bit of a chance to have a look at them. I wonder if there's a particular passage or a particular theme that really jumps out for you that you'd like us to turn to first.
Yeah, so I was looking at all three of these passages, and I guess the overall arching narrative that kind of jumps out immediately at me is about God's salvific plan, which is being established. So firstly, in Exodus 20, we've got the children of Israel who were in slavery, and yet God says, actually, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery, and you shall have no other gods before me. And then there's the sense of actually the whole of the biblical narrative going through the Old Testament, and then also culminating in Jesus coming to earth. There's this sense of actually God's salvific plan of bringing us all out of oppression, all out of bondage, all out of situations of injustice. And so within each of those three texts, there are those elements, and this sense of, even in 1 Corinthians, of actually it's the cross of Christ that brings salvation, that is the wisdom of God, but foolishness for others. So really, I think out of the three passages, it was really Jesus cleansing the temple that I would probably choose to preach on, and maybe pull out a couple of other verses from the other passages as well. The thing that I really appreciated about the John's Gospel passage is it was also approaching Passover. So you've got this sense of remembering when the Jews, when they were held captive in slavery, effectively, and God brought them out of Egypt. And so there's that connection with the Exodus passage there as well. And of course, as part of those celebrations, they lasted for 7 days, and often sacrifices were made. And we know, according to Levitical law, often 2 doves or pigeons were required to be offered as sacrifice. And yet, what Jesus was protesting against was actually the Jewish center for worship, what was being used for economic purposes. It was being used to create profit for those who were selling. So anyone who wanted to come into the temple and to offer a sacrifice, whether it was the pigeons or the doves or even the lamb, then actually they would pay exorbitant amounts to be able to do that. And of course, economically, that just can't work for everybody. So already you've got a system of exclusion and inclusion within that passage. And so it excludes all those who are on the margins of society, perhaps at the bottom of the economic ladder. And, with the church planting that I did with the Rough Sleepers, I was thinking about this in that, often our structures within churches or, even societal structures, it marginalizes those very much who aren't within the main economic system. And often people don't feel comfortable accessing those structures because of that marginality. And so actually Jesus is responding with zeal. There's this sense of his response is one that is zealous. and he's very much, kind of protesting against this, and actually, he's saying, the temple of worship, it needs to be one of equality, it needs to be one of inclusion, it needs to be one where everyone is able to access and have an opportunity to worship God. So I think for kicking off, that is kind of where I would find my angle with preaching for this text.
Thank you. Yes, I was I was looking at some commentaries as well, and I was really struck by the idea that even though the temple is this kind of Jewish symbol of unity, how it become this symbol of disunity, because the temple priests were really scorned for their rubbing alongside the Romans in the way they did, that it wasn't just them that were benefiting, that they were paying into the hands of the Roman occupiers. So this is Marilyn Salmon, and she's saying that under the Roman rule, the priests were not autonomous in their authority, even over their religious matters. And so actually the Roman coffers were benefiting from the marketplace that supported the sacrificial rites. And that so actually really in this season of Passover, we're feeling again these kind of tensions that they're under Roman occupation, that there's something going on here, that even the temple is not quite free. And there's Jesus who's flinging tables about, and he's saying, I'm going to be the temple, and that this thing that's corrupt is going to become instead in me this thing that I'm incorruptible. And I was really struck by that Jesus is both priest and temple, and there's something we could play with in some of that. I was also really struck by I always think that Jesus must be really angry in this passage, but I don't think it actually says that, and I was thinking how much we imply motive so much in when we think about kind of politics or whatever. We often talk about people's motive is so important, and we don't actually see Jesus's motive here. We see his actions. We assume he's angry because, I mean, who makes a cord, a whip out of cords otherwise? But I just think it's really interesting that we're shown his emotion. We're not really told his emotion. And I wonder, when we're preaching it, often one of the conversations that I have is kind of, we always had at college, in fact, was like doing what the text does, not just saying what the text says. And I wonder if there's something about how we might show our emotion as we're preaching this, that in kind of the way it is said, and kind of the actions here, isn't it, as much as what we're kind of is what we're doing that really shows our motive, not what we're kind of feeling on the inside, that seems to be less important. Yeah.
I find that really helpful, actually, and this sense of picking up your theme about being under Roman occupation. Again, you've got themes of slavery and oppression and lack of freedom coming out, and I was reading Ched Myers, whose political commentary. He writes about how often there are two bodies. So there's the body politique, which would be the social or political practices of the dominant power at that time, but then also the physical or the self. And he says that actually in John 2, Jesus enters into conflict in the temple because of how he places his body within the accepted or expected proprieties of social space, crossing boundaries of power and prestige. So you've got these dominant narratives coming through. You've got the narrative of the temple narrative and also Roman occupation, but then in contrast, you've got this conflict of Jesus's kingdom being established on earth, and actually there's this clash, this confrontation, and of course with politics in the pulpit, this is where it becomes prophetic. That this is where injustice is highlighted, and an opportunity to speak truth to power becomes evident. Because in this passage there's a sense of being physically in this political realm, but it's a contrasting narrative and contrasting kind of empire kingdom conflict which is coming out.
Thank you. Yeah. I wonder if we need to touch on any of the others passages, just to kind of if in case people have been steadfastly determined to preach on the Old Testament this Lent or something, and I just looking at kind of I think really appreciating the same sort of culture and context going going on in the life of Corinth as well. Like, you know, that when Paul is preaching some of this stuff around the power and wisdom of God, it's in a setting where he's just actually fluffed up a bit. He's not been a great preacher, and he's kind of working out what that is. But in a setting where they've got these huge divisions again between the poorest poor and the richest of the rich, and kind of he's talking into this world about kind of what power and strength might look like. And kind of this idea that there is corruption and vice in this world, and kind of him preaching this this alternative Christ crucified somehow seems to be this thing that looks like a symbol of shame is somehow this, you know, actually this symbol of salvation. We've also got Exodus in the background, and it's I just think it's really interesting, isn't it? We think about politics, and actually law comes up quite a lot, and kind of what's legal. And here we're given a set of laws. You know, we're given a law. We're given a set of 10 commandments. And you mentioned already this coming out of slavery, that this is the context into which it is brought, and it does feel very legal when we read it. I think we kind of see it as a sort of to-do list, you know. But actually, it starts with this relational gift of I am the Lord your God, doesn't it? I have brought you out of, this is my relationship with you. Whatever happens, this is already set in place. I've already this God who's already done all of this for you. But I wonder how interesting it is that these people who've been brought out of slavery, perhaps not quite feeling free yet. Like, what does that really mean? What's that really going to look like? That these are the questions, you know, they're kind of wandering around. What is God doing with us? We're not making bricks anymore. But you know, but how is God different to Pharaoh? What is this new world going to be, and what does this really look like? And into this is the kind of the relational message that seems to be kind of part and parcel of what we're getting through Exodus.
And it brings out a new ethical framework which is based on justice for the children of Israel. You know, the Collins Dictionary, it defines justice as fairness in the way that people are treated. And actually, when we think of the 10 Commandments, you know, a large proportion of those are about the way that God hopes that the children of Israel will treat each other, you know, with respect and dignity. And then, of course, it's about how they also respond to God. So, yeah, the vertical and horizontal relationships. And actually, it's an ethical framework of justice, which is being outlived within that.
And it's Brueggemann, I think, who says in his book about the Sabbath, and obviously because the Sabbath comes up in here, and I open that, and he emphasizes in this post-brick making community, and he says the odd insistence of the God of Sinai is to counter anxious productivity with committed neighborliness. And this idea that 6 of these laws are about neighborliness, that God is not Pharaoh asking for more and more and more production, but actually God is this God who's saying, no, go and be committed neighbors. This is the sort of people I want you to be. And I think that was really helpful, perhaps a helpful reflection for those of us who are feeling locked down at the moment, and actually the work is in our houses, or for those who are out as key workers who are never stopping work because they're being very busy. And there's a lot there, I think, pastorally as well as kind of politically, you could kind of do something with, I think, if you were preaching on this.
And one of the comforting verses in that Exodus passage, I think the whole passage, you know, it can often be feel a bit legalistic. It's lots of do's and don'ts. But actually verse 6 is, for me, the heart of the passage. Actually, God is saying, actually, I will show steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love and keep my commandments. And there's this sense of, actually, this is the core. It's the relationship, isn't it, between God and his people. And this sense of God's faithfulness, even in the midst of having come out of slavery, and maybe for them questioning where is God in all of this, you know, he's revealing himself to them now. And in lockdown, there's also a sense sometimes, you know, God, where are you? And yet it's maybe a gentle reminder that, yeah, his steadfast love is still present with us.
And just after, actually, it's always think it's interesting where we start and end our passages, and just after this, God is described as being the God of darkness. God is described as being kind of, this darkness that Moses goes back to. And I just think, isn't that interesting that we almost always imagine like God in terms of light and kind of hope and the shininess of God. And here God is described as darkness. And I just thought that was really telling. It's just after this passage. But that actually maybe there's something about in this space of kind of thinking that where is God in the gloom? Where is God when we can't see our way forward? That actually God is darkness as well as light, that God creates darkness as well as light, that this is sort of, there's something about this idea that we've kind of, we've got this particular perspective that maybe kind of God is only interested in the kind of glowy bits of life and work. And God is there in the bad news stuff too, and God is even present as something that makes things dark at times, which is an interesting thing to think about and try and unpick.
Absolutely. We do some work with survivors of modern slavery, and for those who do have faith, it's been really interesting hearing some of their reflections about God being present in the midst of their captivity. And one individual in particular who has given permission for his story to be shared, but he can think of a couple of occasions where he almost died because of the oppressive situations that he was in. And yet he said, I felt that there was something bigger than myself that was there watching over me and protecting me, and maybe, giving me actually an opportunity to have a better day, a better future. So this sense of actually in extreme suffering and captivity, physical or perhaps more widely for the rest of us, spiritually, emotionally, actually God is present in that darkness, like you're saying, and this sense of even though we are surrounded by darkness, actually, God is there, and nothing can stop that or take that away from us.
I know you've done some thinking in the past about Holy Saturday as a kind of way of understanding God's presence. So rather than kind of rushing from the kind of the cross to the kind of the glory of resurrection, the kind of lingering in Holy Saturday as a kind of spiritual metaphor for kind of understanding God's work of redemption as well. That's quite important.
Absolutely, this sense of often, we're a little bit triumphal in that, Christ has died, and then actually, we fast forward to the third day, but we forget, that in between period of we're waiting for resurrection, but actually it's not quite happening yet, and so yes, we can still experience the trauma of Good Friday and the death and the horribleness and destruction of what Good Friday brought, and also within our own lives. So yes, we still experience trauma, but actually we do look forward to that hope that one day we will be healed. And that sense of actually, the garden, the New Jerusalem is for the healing of the nations. And the sense of, this eschatological hope, that yes, we are saved now, but actually full salvation will be continued to be worked out throughout history in the healing of the nations.
Well, thank you, Dan. It's been brilliant to have your wisdom and for you to share your reflections with us this week. There's so much in that. I think, I think the way you say it, as well as what you say, just shows how much this hope permeates your whole life and your work. So thank you for bringing that and bringing all of that deep theological wisdom and resourcing to us this week. We're really grateful. Thank you also to those of you who've come to join us. We're talking to each other. We're talking with everybody who's gathered to watch this and to listen to us. And so thank you for joining with us and asking that question of whether or how we should preach politics in our pulpits this week. So let's go both into our politics world and into our pulpit worlds with a blessing. May we be anointed with God's Spirit as we bring good news to the poor, proclaim release to the captives, help people to see the world truthfully, and let the oppressed go free. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks.